I was going to talk to you mainly about why we need to focus on advanced manufacturing and what sort of context we're looking at for this sort of push. But interestingly, as has already been mentioned, the Federal Minister for Industry, Macfarlane, is right now announcing the recommendations of his panel findings on how the federal government would like to respond to South Australia and Victoria's loss of the automotive industry. They're really looking at further assessment, identifying emerging sectors and further investigation at this stage to work out how they should best spend the money that they have allocated or looking at allocating. What's interesting in the panel's findings, though, is that for Victoria, they do identify the areas of comparative advantage that we should be growing as food and agriculture, advanced manufacturing, biomedical products, mining equipment, technologies and services, finance services, tourism, education and health services. Now, what I find really interesting in this list is that they've identified advanced manufacturing as somehow a separate sector, so somehow separate to things like food or biomedical products or mining products. They're identified separately. So it sort of raises the question that we were looking at in this CEDA project of what is advanced manufacturing and why does Australia need it? When we first started talking to CEDA about this research paper and the full project, the question naturally arose of what is advanced manufacturing. At AI Group, we had quite a deep discussion with many of our members about this, and it's quite hard to pin down to one sector. So from our perspective, we think it's more helpful to look at advanced manufacturing as a concept or an approach rather than narrowing it down to one sector or another. In particular, in the policy context, we think it can be a little bit dangerous to try and narrow this down to just a few bits of manufacturing, and because that runs the risk of pushing other segments out of the policy discussion completely, and we would like to see all of manufacturing included. For example, textiles, clothing and footwear is often pushed aside as an area of no advantage for Australia, an area of very high labour costs that is definitely going offshore. That might be true for the aggregate, but there are still companies within that sector that are advanced and that are doing some fairly amazing things on the technology front, and in fact some of those companies are highlighted by the panel in its recommendations from the Minister. So just a small example of how advanced manufacturing is probably more all-inclusive and encompassing of manufacturing than we might think. What I did want to focus on today, just quickly, because I know we're running through these presentations fairly fast, is why do we need advanced manufacturing in Australia and why do we need to renew it now? It sometimes does feel like this discussion's been going on for decades, and if we think back to, say, the 1980s and 1990s tariff debates, there was constant discussion at the time of pushing manufacturing up the value chain, of pushing it into global markets, of developing more advanced patterns of work. So it's certainly not a new concept, and it's something that manufacturing has been moving into for quite some time. That said, it probably hasn't happened fast enough, and it hasn't happened to the extent that we'd probably like it to, and that's reflected in the malaise that we've seen across manufacturing over particularly the last 5 years. It's important for the whole economy, though. It's not just about manufacturing. To put it into context and why we do need to look at which areas of comparative advantage can be promoted, including within manufacturing, is that Australia's growth rate, just national output, GDP, has been running below average for a couple of years now. It's not terrible, but certainly compared to other developed economies and compared to our own history, it's not a terrible rate. But it's been under 3%, under the trend rate since 2012 now, and that's too low to promote employment growth and incomes growth across the economy. It means that when we look at GDP per capita, national incomes per capita, they're actually going down in real terms at the moment across many areas of the country. It also means that business confidence, business investment growth is weak. Outside the mining sector, it's been flatlining for quite some time. The unemployment rate is already sitting just under 6%, and on most forecasts it will rise from here. So there's many reasons why we'd like that GDP number to be higher. The real risk, though, to my mind, is actually the composition of growth. When we look at the major industrial sectors, most of the growth is coming from mining, which is this orange line up here. And that's a good news story in that this is the output of the mining sector. It's not the investment boom that we're hearing about. And this big surge in output growth is showing us that investment boom is already paying off. Mining outputs are increasing enormously in volume terms. The pricing story, the profits they get from it are quite another thing, but certainly in terms of volumes they're increasing enormously. The services sector, which is about 70% of the Australian economy, is this blue line running under the GDP number, and as you can see, it's average, it's not great. The two that are of most concern, manufacturing, which has been contracting, and construction, which interestingly has had a period of contraction despite that mining investment boom that we've heard so much about. And that's because the bulk of construction is actually in commercial and residential activity, and they've been in a cyclical slump for some time and are just coming out of it. Why does this all matter so much? Well, the composition does matter, particularly when we look at the geographic spread of the composition of growth. Again, although it's true that the headline growth rate isn't too bad, 2.8 at the latest reading, 2.6 for 2012-13. When we look across the states of Australia, the high growth is coming out of the mining states. That's been true for a couple of years now. The New South Wales and Victoria are running below 2% growth at the moment, so on a GDP per capita basis, we're looking at fairly flat, if not negative, income growth. For South Australia and poor old Tasmania in the middle there, growth rates are extremely weak. When we look at the industry composition of growth, there's quite a few bars there. That's just the ABS classifications of industries. If you just focus on the top 6 bars there, those top 6 biggest industries produce almost half of our GDP in output terms. It's about 46% at the moment. The two largest are mining and finance services in the value of their outputs. Mining is now worth more than 10% of our economy, and finance isn't far behind. Manufacturing, though, is still in that top group, and it's actually still our 4th largest industry in terms of the value of its output, and that's after a continuous period of contraction and difficulty, so still quite significant. Manufacturing is probably alone in that top group, though, in experiencing a period of decline. Interestingly, though, professional services has had a fairly rough trot over the last year, and as has already been mentioned, the linkages from manufacturing into other parts of the economy, into the services sectors, are very, very strong. The professional services group is ABS speak for things like law services, accounting, engineering, consulting, design, all services that manufacturing uses very heavily. So the downturn in manufacturing does clearly show up in other sectors. And in this case, it's 2 of our very largest sectors, our biggest income earners, so quite significant. The significance of mining and finance taking the top spots, this is a fairly recent development for Australia. It's a change. It's not sort of good or bad in itself. It's just what's happening and something we need to be aware of and need to adjust to. But there are some characteristics of these industries that, from a national policy perspective, we need to be mindful of. Both of these industries are highly globalised. They're both directly exposed to global financial markets, and to that extent they can increase our country's vulnerability to global financial cycles and disruptions. They're also very capital intensive, they're not labour intensive. Mining, for example, although it's over 10% of output, it's only 2 to 3% of the workforce. Similarly for finance, its status at the top there certainly isn't reflected in the numbers that it employs. So they're small industries for employment numbers, but very concentrated in terms of income and spread. The other thing, of course, is when we look at things like adjustment requirements for South Australia and Victoria, is they're also geographically concentrated. Mining, for obvious reasons, is to the north and the west of Australia. The finance sector is very much concentrated in Melbourne and Sydney. So there's geographic issues arising on a policy front there too that we need to think about. The other growth industries being really driven by other things than global economics. Health, of course, is driven by demographics and local incomes, as is things like education, retail, trade and transport. So a really interesting mix of industries in our economy, but just mindful of what some of the policy implications are of that change in mix. As I said, manufacturing is still one of our largest industries, and I think when you hear the media commentary about manufacturing is dying and we don't make anything anymore, it's really a bit sad because it's just not true, and it is still a very important sector. Over the past 5 years, that said, output volumes have declined by about 8% since 2008. Employment has declined by 13%. And aggregate profits has actually had the biggest drop, 40% over the 5 years to June 2013. On the ABS measures, manufacturing's profit margins are now at their lowest ever recorded. But even after that drop, it is still an important industry, and on many metrics it punches above its weight. So when you look at measures like its contribution to CapEx, private expenditure, and particularly R&D spending, it's certainly over that. Similarly, with our export earnings, around 35% of goods exports come from manufactured goods. A fair chunk of that is actually automotive though, so we're probably going to be saying goodbye to that section of it. Around 10% of manufacturing businesses directly export, and far more are involved in exporting through those supply chains, which can be quite complex. Again, those that are in the manufacturing chain, pretty much all of them are counted as those exporting businesses, and they'll be going. So we do need to look at what's going to take its place. Just to put the employment numbers into some context for you, again, just, there's lots of metrics for measuring the success and the growth and the importance of various sectors. Employment's an easy one because it's easy for people to understand and to identify. Manufacturing employment has actually recovered a little bit over the last 6 months. About 13,000 jobs have come back since last August nationally. However, that's after a loss of close to 140,000 jobs since 2008, which is about 12% of the workforce. So very big cuts to headcount employment across the industry and to hours worked. It's actually a very similar magnitude to what we saw in the 1990s recession, but I think it's been less visible because it's happened in a context of lower unemployment rates, better job opportunities elsewhere, but also a much older workforce. So more of those people are moving directly out of the workforce and into retirement. What are some of the challenges to moving into advanced manufacturing? We've talked about that quite a bit in the CEDA paper, but some of the ones that come up in our own research, and these apply to all countries, but I think are particularly important for manufacturing given its trade exposure and the focus that so many businesses have on export markets. The WEF conducts this global competitiveness research every year and has done for well over a decade, and AI Group conducts part of the Australian component for them. The overall rankings for Australia have been slipping over the last decade, and we're now ranked 21st in terms of overall competitiveness. But the detail gives us some clues on what we need to focus on to get those competitive advantages off the ground and to assist sectors such as manufacturing or advanced manufacturing. One of them, which has fallen quite considerably, is in the labour market area. The WEF calls it flexibility of wages. They don't actually mean wage rates. What they mean is the flexibilities around wages and conditions. So it goes to things like work hours, ability to hire and fire. Australia's rankings there have slipped quite significantly, as has the burden of government regulation, and this is a theme we see quite consistently across AI Group's research. There is a perception out there that this has definitely worsened over the last couple of years. We're doing better, however, on technology that firms use in their own business, and that's a real positive that I think we can build on, as is the infrastructure numbers, because although they've deteriorated a little bit, they're not looking too bad. Just quickly on trade, we've also slipped on the trade rankings, but most of that relates to market access for Australian businesses when they are exporting. So we've slipped considerably in terms of the relative ability of Australian businesses to export. So that speaks to our free trade agreements, our access arrangements with other countries. Again, on some of the other measures, we're actually not too bad, but if you pick out those areas that we're really scoring poorly on, that gives us clues on where the policy work needs to be directed. Finally, an area that we focused on far more in our written material for this CEDA project is what needs to happen at the workplace level. Moving further into advanced manufacturing, we need to be a little bit careful about how that's going to be judged. One of them I know will be employment numbers and headcount, and on that score it probably will be a smaller sector, higher skill, higher value, probably higher terms and conditions for those that are in it. But we need to look at whether our workforce is ready, what sort of assistance they will require to move further into that advanced sector. Manufacturing in particular has one of the lowest scores on things like literacy, numeracy and problem solving, and a related area that AI Group has identified across industries in the industrial sectors is the STEM group of skills. So that's science, technology, engineering and maths, and I'm sure our other speakers will have some comments on that. But in terms of factors within workplaces that we need to focus on, this is probably the single largest one. Finally, just what are sort of the government policy areas that AI Group is looking at for manufacturing and for the industrial sector more broadly? We did try to come up at the start of this year with a top 3 or a top 5, and we actually got it only down to 10 key policy areas, which is probably still too broad, but it gives you an idea of what we think we need to look at nationally to get more of a focus on advanced manufacturing happening in reality and how it would actually translate into activity. For our purposes today, I think things like workplace relations, workforce skills, manufacturing performance, and particularly building innovation and business capability are really where we need to be looking at. If advanced manufacturing is one of our comparative advantages, and the Ministers' panel has identified it as such today, we really need to look at how we can translate that into activity. Thank you.